I'm going to start by just reading a little thing that I wrote, which is it's a little boring to read it as opposed to speaking extemporaneously, but you can get the information in more coherently that way. So welcome to this webinar sponsored by the Association for Spiritual Integrity. My name is Rick Archer. I'm the creator and host of the Buddha at the Gas Pump podcast. And one of the founders also of the Association for Spiritual Integrity. A couple of weeks ago, I had as my guests on BatGap, Derek Barris, Matthew Remski, and Julian Walker, who are the creators and hosts of the Conspirituality podcast. I'm a big fan of that. I've listened to all the episodes that they've produced so far. And I think it's a really important topic that they cover. And here's the reason why, and here's why it's relevant to the Association of Spiritual Integrity. And here's the part that I actually wrote beforehand. As in previous pandemics and times of social upheaval, conspiracy theories have become a psychological pandemic within a physical one. The spiritual and wellness communities are not immune and even seem to be more susceptible, as evidenced by this sampling of recent articles. I'll just read some article titles. 6 reasons so many spiritual people have been fooled by QAnon. Anatomy of delusion, how otherwise conscious people descended into the darkness. Conspirituality, the overlap between New Age and conspiracy beliefs. How QAnon infiltrated the yoga world. Leaders in the yoga community speak out against QAnon. Nazi hippies, when the New Age and far right overlap. The red pill overlap, why New Age yogis have swallowed QAnon conspiracies. Unmasking spiritual psychopathy. Wellness influencers are calling out QAnon conspiracy theorists for spreading lies. Why are conspiracy theories rampant in the wellness industry? Welcome to Conspirituality. And yoga teachers take on QAnon. And there are many more. And there are 2 points in the code of ethics that the ASI wrote up, which I think pertain to this. Point number 6 is being self-aware, open, and humble about the limitations of our knowledge and experience. And point number 8 is refraining from giving counsel in matters outside our areas of training and expertise and making appropriate referrals as needed. And quoting from the Conspirituality podcast, many spiritual teachers are undermining public health efforts in times of crisis. Some explicitly promote QAnon. Others exploit their followers by co-opting conspiracy theories on a spectrum of intensity, ranging from vaccines to child trafficking. In the process, spiritual beliefs that have nurtured creativity and meaning are transforming into memes of a quickly globalizing paranoia. The Conspirituality podcast attempts to bring understanding to this landscape. A journalist, a cult researcher, and a philosophical skeptic discuss the stories, cognitive dissonances, and cultic dynamics tearing through the yoga, wellness, and new spirituality worlds. So far, we just have Derek with us of the 3 co-hosts of the Conspirituality podcast. Matthew Remski's mother is dying, unfortunately, and he had to cancel for obvious reasons. And Julian Walker should be joining us shortly, but we'll start with Derek. And I think I'll just ask Derek to speak now on whatever comes to mind that he'd like to say by way of introduction. And unlike the BatGap interview I did with these guys, and also unlike their podcast itself, this will be more of a interactive conversation. So any of you listening who wants to chime in when Derek is finished, please do by raising your hand, and we'll just take it from there. So go ahead, Derek.
Well, I guess the best entry point would be there's Julian, would be a discussion of where we decided to start this podcast. And I've started in journalism in 1993 when I was in college. I have a degree in religion, and I heard Philip say he has a book about how the Vedas were brought to America. My focus was on how Buddhism and Hinduism and Taoism were misinterpreted when they came into America. So I've always been fascinated by all sorts of religious ideas. I've never particularly felt anyone spoke to me personally, but I like storytelling. So In a sense, throughout my career as a music journalist and as a movement instructor and different facets of my career, I've always been fascinated by different manifestations of spirituality. And I've also been skeptical of the ways that they are, the difference, I guess you could say, between what is being espoused and how it's being lived out, both on individual and social levels. So specifically, I started practicing yoga in 1999. I studied the yoga texts while in college, and then I started teaching in 2003. And I've taught up until the pandemic started. And I've also been critical of the yoga industry, and specifically the industry, not necessarily always the practices, although that too. But the differences between all of these ideas about yoga, about shedding the ego, and then the way that yoga has manifested in America is very much about the ego. So for the past decade, and Julian and I actually started a website in 2011 with 3 other yoga instructors called Yoga Brains, where we thought critically about some of these topics in yoga and wellness. And it did well, but we had a very small audience at that time. And we got a lot of pushback in general anytime we spoke out against monetizing supplements or the ways that retreats were being sold. The promises of yoga were always seemed to be very romanticized. And then, so I've had my own podcast for a number of years. And then I asked Julian and Matthew to be on it around the turn of this year when the pandemic had started, because of specifically of conspirituality. I had read Jules Evans's piece, Rick referenced it. And then I wrote a piece for Big Think that where I've been a columnist for a decade, and that really took off. So I realized that a lot more people in the yoga and wellness world were suddenly being a little more critical about what was being said by some of their instructors and these influencers. And it all converged around the pandemic, where QAnon, which is a 4-year-old theory now, had made inroads into the wellness community, all based around this idea of bodily sovereignty. And I had Matthew and Julian on, and it went really well. I've known both of them for about a decade. And so we did it again the next week. And then I said, hey, why don't we make this a regular podcast where the 3 of us independently have been criticizing, but also looking at the value of yoga. We're not just critics, we're all instructors. We know deeply what it can bring to people and communities as well. And so spirituality grew out of that. And very quickly, we just kind of were in the right place at the right time discussing these topics. And we sort of have become a hub for people who care about their body, care about, have spiritual practices, but are very confused or angry about their instructors who are now suddenly talking about Donald Trump being a world savior to battle pedophiles, and the anti-mask, anti-lockdown movements that have grown up around this, which have infiltrated the yoga and wellness communities as well. So those are the topics we look at. We look at anti-vaccination efforts, which are longstanding, and it's something that I've been covering as a science journalist for the last decade. And just the ways, all the intersections between what has manifested as wellness in America and how the right-wing conspiratorial thinking has infiltrated. So that's really what we try to pinpoint and discuss on a weekly basis with the podcast.
Jacqueline has raised her hand, and I just want to give Julian a chance to say something before we start taking questions. So Julian, would you like to add to what Derek said?
Thank you so much, Rick. Thank you for having me, everybody. I apologize for being a little bit late. Yeah, the podcast, we started thinking we'd have a couple of conversations and leave it at that. And now we're 30 episodes in, and we average about 2 hours an episode. So there's no shortage of material. And this confluence of spirituality, the wellness community, and right-wing conspiracy theories, it just keeps going. Sad to say, but it gives us endless things to talk about. I think that what I'll say is I've been a yoga teacher for about 25 years. For most of my life, I've been fascinated with altered states, with psychedelics, with meditation, with things like holotropic breath work, all sorts of mind-body awareness processes and healing modalities. That's where I've lived for my entire adult life. It's how I make my living. It's what I'm fascinated with. It's what I've studied and gotten multiple certifications in. And I've always sort of found, and perhaps some here can relate to this, or perhaps some will be bothered by me saying this, but I've always found that the more spiritual, new age, integrative, holistic community has tended to reject critical thinking and a rigorous scientific method for reasons that are entirely understandable, and for some reasons that I actually agree with, because I'm deeply passionate about experiential, mythopoetic, emotive ways of accessing truth. But I think sometimes it goes too far. And I think there's a way in which the pandemic right now is kind of calling the bluff on some of the over exaggerated claims in our community specifically. And I think part of how we keep our own side of the street healthy and we keep it clean is by being self-critical in appropriate ways. I actually see a lot of what's going on with conspirituality as a profound opportunity for those of us who do have awareness practices and more of a spiritual bent to sort of integrate at the next level and have and be more aware of some of these spiritual bypass, lack of critical thinking, ways of sort of framing reality that for some people have led into being fully red-pilled and just going down the rabbit hole. I came to this particular topic in terms of a broader audience through a piece that I wrote for Medium called The Red Pill Overlap: Why New Age Yogis have, or How New Age Yogis Have Swallowed Right-Wing Conspiracy Theories. And so part of what we've talked about on the podcast is that spiritual communities have sort of been there's been fertile ground there for getting involved in some of this stuff. And so I just think that's good to look at.
Thank you. Incidentally, when I interviewed you guys for Batgap, somebody wrote in the chat during the interview that if we seriously think that we actually sent men to the moon, then we are lacking in our critical thinking skills.
Fantastic. Well, I mean, if you even think there is a moon.
Yeah, right. It's green cheese, isn't it? Okay, let's take a question from Jacqueline. Go ahead, Jacqueline. I'm unmuting you. You have to unmute yourself once I have clicked that little button. You should see a pop-up window, Jacqueline, where you can unmute yourself once I've asked you to unmute yourself.
Yes.
There you go.
I think you can hear me now.
I can. Good, thank you.
Yes, that's good. First of all, I put my hand up just in case I'm on a tablet, an Android, and the way I can raise my hand is clicking on the right-hand corner where it says raise. That's the only way I can get a hands up. Somebody might need that information.
Good.
Okay. So yes, there's a couple of things I've noticed. This talk about the right wing conspiritualists or whatever. I've never been, looking critically at what is happening on the planet as being right wing. And another thing I question is lumping spiritual and new age together. For me, they are two very different things. So, and I can't stay long on the talk this time, but I don't know everybody on the talk. So I would just like to say that I've been working with people in consciousness for over 30 years. And I have an ashram in India by the sacred hill Arunachala. And I hold meditation retreats and teachings and satsangs around the world. But something very strange happened for me quite a few years ago. I saw a photograph of this man called David Icke, and I knew we were deeply spiritually connected. I didn't have time to read his book, but I invited him to Denmark, and he gave a talk, and at the end of the talk, I knew without a doubt I had to give 7 years of my life and work to investigating what he was talking about. I did that. And David and I traveled together in many countries in the world, and I have experienced a lot. I have been with him to interview people, and it was quite a 7 years. When the 7 years were up, some people said, don't give it up, Jacqueline, because we need people like you who are awake spiritually to be able to handle this information so it isn't used in a negative way. But what happened when the 7 years were up, some organization bought 5 acres of land for me for an ashram in India. So it seemed like I had to stick to my 7 years. But I can still have people who come to me during satsangs, and in the middle of a satsang will ask, you know, something that you would kind of call a conspiracy theory, but where I can address, you know, what they are talking about. So, and you may know, you know, the expression conspiracy theories was something that the CIA created after the murder of JFK, so that anybody getting close to what had really happened, you could just say, oh, it's just a conspiracy theory, and people would go back to sleep. So I don't have much to share this evening, but I just don't want to see, you know, it is part of my dharma to address these kind of things. And I don't want people to just get this idea that anybody who's looking at the manipulation of consciousness on this planet, because that's what's happening, that they're conspiracy theorists and that it's not spiritual. Because I meet quite a lot of that, not from people who know me well. And I just want to say a little thing about Donald Trump. I hope you don't mind. But I was in LA at the time of the election. And
the first one, you mean 2016?
Yes, that's right. Yeah. And I was staying with a friend of mine who was going out to a celebration party for Hillary Clinton. So I stayed alone in her home because my heart was really with Bernie Sanders. And then, you know, suddenly it's announced that Trump has won. And I'm amazed what happens to me. I get this rush of energy coming up like this, and this enormous open excitement. And I'm thinking, what's this about? Next day, all I could hear in my head most of the day was Leonard Cohen singing, "There's a crack in everything, that's how the light gets in." Some of you have heard me say this before. And I see Trump as the crack, so the light can come in. If Hillary Clinton had got in, America would have been celebrating the first woman president, and then everybody would have gone back to sleep. As I see it now, people are on the edge of their seats. You know, what's going to happen next? What's Trump going to say next? I see him simply as the crack that is allowing more light to come in. So that's really all I want to share tonight, Rick. And I will just hang on here as long as I can be here.
Yeah, and I'll keep you unmuted because you know, Derek and Julian will probably want to respond to what you just said, and you might want to come back with another, you know, comment or something. So go ahead, Derek or Julian.
One thing when I hear things like this is it reminds me, and it's something we've argued about in the wellness community, especially I live in Los Angeles for 9 years now, is the level of privilege that people who live in Los Angeles have that can go to Erewhon or Whole Foods and never really have to worry about whether or not they're going to eat that night, for example. Los Angeles has a homeless epidemic. 2 directions of me, there's encampments of about 100 people within a mile of each direction. One's very close to Julian. And I think about the immigrants, the migrant children who were held at the border, and there's something like at least 600 who still have not been reunited with their parents right now. So the idea that Donald Trump is any sort of light worker really fails me when I hear things like that. Because if you watch, and I grew up in New Jersey, and Ivanka was my yoga student for a while. So I kind of been around the vibe and the family personally. And people where I'm from always knew he was a grifter. We always knew he was a joke. But because of the magic of reality television, he was made to appear to be something he's not. And he's exploited that very well for a number of decades now. I mean, that's been his whole career. So, you know, this idea that he's brought something necessary, there are thousands, if not tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people whose lives have been completely upended because of his policies and what he's done. And you can also just look at data, which is predominantly what I do. And when you look at the number of people who have died in this country because of the pandemic, all stemming from a complete lack of oversight on a federal level that has happened in this country and is continuing to happen, as evidenced this past week by the lack of the rollout of the vaccine. It's a really hard thing to hear, because if you're sitting back in a place where you don't have to worry about those things, it might make like a nice story. But for the people on the ground who have been killed by his policies, I don't see any light coming through any cracks in that. That'll be it.
Julian, do you want to comment? Oh, go ahead, Jacqueline.
Yeah, thank you. Because I just want to say, when I listen to that, I think, oh, good heavens. First of all, I'm not calling Donald Trump a light worker. I didn't say that. I really didn't. You know, it's amazing how just the word Trump can trigger stuff in people, you know, so we get this loss of clarity. I'm not from LA, I'm from Denmark. I just happened to be in LA at the time. And another thing I was going to say was, you know, you mentioned Trump as a joker. Yeah, I think he's kind of the joker in the pack. But no way am I saying that he's a light worker. And I know very well what's going on in the world and the suffering on this planet. I really, really do. But I also know how many things are being manipulated. And, you know, in America, you have a lot of Steiner schools, Rudolf Steiner schools, Waldorf. Maybe you know that over 100 years ago, Rudolf Steiner warned about vaccines that would be coming out, like in the times we're living in. And he warned that there would even be vaccines that would turn children away from their natural spirituality. So, you know, I feel we have to keep a really open mind and investigate. I think I said something about this last time. I can't remember what it was I said on the last one, but we need to keep an open mind and investigate and not have any holy cows to protect. If Donald Trump was my holy cow, I wouldn't be open to seeing the truth. You understand me? I think I said this on the last meeting. But no way am I calling him a light worker.
Okay.
I just want to stick in a quick comment before these guys comment again. And that is that I discovered through this Conspirituality podcast, this really great YouTube channel called Debunk the Funk with Dr. Wilson. And I actually downloaded and extracted the audio from all of the videos on that channel. And I've been listening to them on my daily walks in the park. But he's molecular and structural biologist, and he really knows his stuff, and he goes into deep detail in terms that a layman can understand on all the various topics like vaccines and, you know, COVID tests and you know, wearing masks and all the other issues that are health related around in that are flying around these days. So Debunk the Funk with Dr. Wilson.
I just have one question for Jacqueline, and thank you for that before Julian jumps in. But this has been one of my criticisms of the term spirituality for a long time, and you referenced it. So I apologize for misconstruing the light worker, because that's a common theme that is happening right now in conspirituality, the crack, what you said, and it's usually related to light worker. So I apologize for misconstruing that aspect, but you did preference it by saying that if Hillary would have won, then people would have celebrated women and then gone back to sleep. And my problem with so much of spirituality is who gets to decide who's sleeping? And does that always mean that the person saying it is awake? And this cuts across the board of all sorts of religions. And that's why I opened my segment saying that I never found any religion or spirituality practice satisfying when they thought they had, as Alan Watts used to say, some secret sauce that the other ones didn't have. And so who gets to decide who's sleeping? Because I don't agree, living here my entire life, I don't agree that people would have gone to sleep if Hillary Clinton would have won.
Well,
Julian, do you want to say anything before Jacqueline?
Jacqueline, if you don't mind, and thank you so much for sharing everything that you have, Jacqueline. A few things pop out at me, but I think underneath all of it, there is a central question. And that question is, how do we talk about knowledge? How do we talk about different ways of coming to knowledge? And in philosophy, this is called epistemology, but I won't go into a boring kind of pedantic thing about that. But just to say that I think that what goes on is that in our community of people who are interested in what I refer to as awareness practices, as a sort of big umbrella for self-development and spirituality, meditation, there's lots of different things under that, as I'm sure you're all familiar with. I think that we tend to really value the experiential, the heart-centered, the non-conceptual, realms of non-dual sort of consciousness, awakening, ways of being in relationship to our stream of experience, the phenomenology of our experience through more meditative practices. That's a very valuable, certainly to me, and beautiful way of interacting with a specific aspect of what it is to be human. But I think it often is not the best way for approaching questions of science and politics and the world and suffering and even psychology. I think there are other tools in our toolbox that we can get really good at using as well. And this is one of my criticisms over time that emerged, and I criticized it in myself first as someone who is on a spiritual path or part of the New Age community, is I started to realize that certain things were really overdeveloped and certain things were underdeveloped or rejected or pushed into the shadow. And so when I think about what a conspiracy theory is, I have heard the claim that conspiracy theory is just an invented term that the CIA came up with around JFK, and there may be some cultural sort of validity to that. But in technical terms, there are real conspiracies. Real conspiracies are uncovered using modes of inquiry, modes of discovering knowledge, like investigative journalism, like scientific evidence, like well-reasoned arguments that hang together, that make sense, whoever looks at them. It's not just a subjective opinion. It's not just a bias. It's not just a relative claim. When you really uncover an actual conspiracy, there's a solid set of evidence and data and a way of arguing and making the connections that adds up. A conspiracy theory, in terms of the technical definition, tends to be based on weak evidence, leaps in reasoning, something that's called a paranoid explanatory style, where you have to always find a hidden bad guy that you vaguely sort of define, or that comes from another dimension, or it has some sort of supernatural origin, or sadly often is the Jews or whomever else has been designated as the secret puller of strings. Conspiracy theories tend to have lots of logical fallacies in them. So anyone who understands logical reasoning kind of looks at it and goes, I don't know if that adds up. I mean, it's possible, right? So you can be open-minded towards a conspiracy theory, and a conspiracy theory might turn out to be an actual conspiracy that's been uncovered if it has strong enough evidence behind it. But there's a really clear distinction there. And I think applying intuitive, emotional, non-dual, any kind of spiritual lens to claims about the world that are as outlandish as the sort of things David Icke talks about, it tends not to go well. You tend to go down a road where you're believing some really, really outlandish, bizarre, and frankly, in the conditions that we're in right now, dangerous things about actual lived reality that we all share, that we have to come to some kind of agreement about, what's going on if we're to move forward.
Jacqueline, do you want to respond to that?
Yes, I would like to respond to that, because first of all, I'm not into believing. I'm really not. And when I talked about people going back to sleep, I'm talking about people being unconscious, not knowing what's going on in the world. I'm not talking on a spiritual level. simply. And
how do we?
I'm talking about what David Icke sometimes, and I'm not working with David Icke anymore. I was with him 7 years and that was over. But he talked about how important it was that people were streetwise, not having their heads stuck in the clouds.
Well,
And one of the things
I would
I always
agree with that.
also say, if I could just finish, one of the things I would also say about the shadow, an important part of my work with people is helping them to face their own shadow. As I often say, if you can't face your own shadow, you can't face the collective shadow. So I don't really feel that you know where I'm coming from, and that's okay. We've never met, but I studied this for 7 years. I interviewed people all over the place, all over the planet, and I've read and I've studied, and you know, and I'm just not into this belief or sticking the head in the clouds. Really, I'm not. I have a lot of focus on the heart with people, but I don't mean lovey-dovey stuff. I mean the deep, deep connection with the spiritual heart.
It sounds beautiful. It sounds beautiful. And I'm right there with you. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I wanted to ask you a question. I agree with David Icke that being streetwise is an important thing. Do you agree with David Icke that the moon is a spaceship and that reptilian alien overlords are seeking to gain control of planet Earth?
Okay, this about the moon, I haven't researched that. I don't know. And this about the reptilian energy, that for me sounded very far out. But, you know, and I don't want to take up too much time here. But when David started coming out with that stuff, I know he didn't have it all quite right. I'm just being honest, I felt he ran with it too quickly. But at that time, I had a wonderful friend who's now left the body, and he could see clearly in all dimensions. And I got a lot of information about the reptilian consciousness there, and I was asked to write a book about this by a ruby red colored reptile that my friend could see. Now, sometime later, before the book had come out, I was sitting in my ashram and a young man came to say goodbye to me. He'd been staying at the ashram and we sat and talked for about half an hour. Before he left, he said, "Jacqueline, I hope you're not going to think I'm crazy, but I have to tell you, the whole time we've been sitting here talking, there's been like this dark red colored reptile behind you." He said, "Don't be afraid." I said, "I'm not." He said, "It's like it's protecting you." So there is something in this. There are different consciousness in many different dimensions, but I don't believe everything David put out, especially in the beginning. I think a lot of it was information and he ran too quickly with it.
Let me chime in quickly and then
I just wanted to say
go ahead, Julian.
And then let's move on. But Jacqueline, thank you so much for everything you have shared and for the anecdotes and you know, stories about your life that clarify why you see it the way you do. And thank you for clarifying what you sort of agree with David Icke on and what you find maybe less plausible. For me, I just want to put out there that for me, awareness practice that is integrated, that is grounded, that is psychologically sort of inclusive in terms of some of what you're talking about the deep heart work, the deep emotional work, goes in the opposite direction of those types of claims. And I mentioned a moment ago, ways of knowing. For me, those ways of knowing are best set aside. And someone who thinks that there is a red reptilian presence behind me probably does need to go and see a psychiatrist. And that's just where I'm coming from on those kinds of topics.
Let me just quickly say where I'm coming from. I know Jacqueline pretty well. I've interviewed her. I've heard David Icke explain his awakening that he had, and it sounded like it was very profound. And I've talked to a lot of people who've had very profound, powerful Kundalini awakenings and things like that.
Myself included.
Pardon?
Myself included.
Yeah. And one thing I've gathered from all that, and including from my own experiences, is that an awakening does not necessarily guarantee or confer sanity or balance or an integrated condition. And that's something one might have to work on for a long time.
Preliminary awakening.
A preliminary awakening. I think there are many degrees of awakening. And also I'm a big believer on there being all kinds of subtle realms and all kinds of beings and entities and whatnot residing in those subtle realms. But I think, as the point Julian's trying to make, is we have to counterbalance that all with a great deal of kind of down-to-earthness and critical thinking. I mean, I've never studied the moon either, but a lot of people have studied the moon, and people have gone to the moon and so on, and I trust what they have found so far. And so I think we have to, we all don't have the time and the expertise to study everything, but we have to somehow learn to know where to put our trust. And that's a kind of a big question. But that's why science exists, and science obviously can get it wrong, and scientists can be biased, and they can cling to outdated paradigms. But science has transformed our world, and I'm sure it has a lot of evolution yet to undergo, but it's given us a lot. So our next questioner is Karen Kernan, and I'm going to unmute you here. Hang on a second. Oh, it looks like you're already unmuted. Good. So go ahead, Karen.
Yes, I'm put on the gallery view here. Thank you. So the reason I came to this talk today is because my issue is what happens to me when I encounter someone who suddenly it's very clear to me that they're a conspiracy theorist, that there's a belief system that what happens to me is I close down to them, and I start getting hard inside, and I start getting my right argument readied, realizing the futility of it. Because so the reason I came here today, and I'm quite triggered right now, because the initial conversation we had immediately went into that. There was a disagreement of, no, I'm right, and you've got me wrong, and well, actually, this is all about, and suddenly we're all not connected. And this is the issue of conspiracy theory for me, is that the unconnection I feel when I'm with someone who is moving into a whole set of what I think can even be dangerous or insane, or I become afraid for the collective. I become afraid for the stability of the group. I become angry. I'm the daughter of a news editor. I believe in the facts. I believe in I can go to the logic, but what's really happening is I don't know how to be with someone who is crazy, in my opinion. And I asked my own teacher about this. I said, how do I not shut down when I'm in the presence of someone like this? Because I've also come to see that if I told a lot of people what I really believe in my own spiritual beliefs, they'd think I was a crazy conspiracy theorist. So I'm left to, how do we be with each other? And that's, so I'm very triggered right now when I saw it all start breaking down immediately into argument. So I just wanted to share that.
Thank you. I'll jump in on that, because that's something I think about a lot. And I think one of the things that we lack, and I'm speaking specifically about what America has turned into in some capacity, is an inability to debate. We don't have that skill. If you when you take debate courses or classes, you don't know what you're going to be given. So you're given an assignment to argue something, and it could actually be something that is the exact opposite of what you believe. But to take that course, you then have to argue it convincingly, even though you don't believe it. And I think that is an exceptionally powerful practice, because it produces empathy and understanding, but it also steals you in these moments. Because honestly, I'm a little triggered when I hear the light thing. And again, I know that I misconstrued part of that, but it's still this idea, of Trump bringing anything good to this country just bothers me in some sense. But once the debate happens, when we're off this call, I might retain some things about it that I'll take and put into my overview or my worldview, but the emotional aspect is gone. It's just like a yoga practice. You know, the first time you might do a down dog or a lunge, your muscles are shaking and your nervous system is overloaded and you're sweating and your mind is disoriented. But through practice and repetition, you can hold those poses for a long time. And that's part of the value of yoga and where I really appreciate it. And I think the same holds true in our emotional life. I don't really consider there much of a difference between physical and mental and emotional lives. It's all, we're one animal. So it's going to work on many levels, but I think there's real value. Like, I think Jacqueline might have dropped off now, but if we kept having a conversation, we would disagree and agree. And that's all fine to me. We just had Charles Eisenstein. Our very first episode of Conspirituality was a kind of a critical look at Charles Eisenstein's ideas. And he just came on last week with Matthew, and they had an excellent talk. And then we deconstructed and talked about where we agreed and where we disagreed. And I think that skill set is so valuable. And if it gets heated sometimes, okay, that's fine. We are passionate animals. Anger is, when I used to teach yoga teacher training programs, I used to say, don't shy away from your anger, use it constructively. So I'm just explaining how I manage those things. And when I come into conflict with people, if there can be some sort of debate and dialogue that's actually constructive in some capacity, awesome. And sometimes it just can't be, and that is what it is. So then you kind of have to shield yourself off from that. And I understand that too. But I think debating is a very important skill, and I don't think we utilize it enough.
Yeah, I wanted to thank you, Karen, for sharing that from such a personal place, just in terms of how it impacts you, and how I'm hearing that the main reason you're here today is that you're wanting to sit with, well, how do I learn how to be present and stay open when I come in contact with this, from this very humble place of saying, you know, I other people might find me to sound kind of crazy at times based on what I think. So how do I not harden myself and not go into this sort of righteousness? And I think for me, it's a very interesting point of inquiry, because what I've started to find over time is that there are multiple modes of being, in a way, that are appropriate to different types of situations. I used to feel, and I'll just speak for myself, I used to feel that it was really important to not get into conflict ever. And that if I was going to stay, sorry, my dog is barking. If I was going to stay in my heart and stay really connected to this higher truth of how we're all one and we're all connected and we're all, you know, equally sort of divine and imperfect, then it was important to not be judgmental, or to not think that I was right and someone else was wrong, and these sorts of ideas. And I think there's a lot of value and beauty in that, especially when we're talking about interpersonal dynamics. So there's a kind of couples therapy tone to everything I was just saying, right? Where when you have interpersonal conflict within your family, say, learning how to have nonviolent communication, learning how to do active listening, learning how to maintain an open heart and be empathic and receive feedback that's offered in a way that's not toxic, right? And really reflect on it, and all of those sorts of skills, I think, are so beautiful and so important. I think that sometimes we overextend in thinking that all of that kind of mode of being and that mode of relating should be applicable to every situation and every person. And I think that there are times when there is going to be conflict, and there are times when you can't come to common ground, and being able to tolerate that from an empathic place, but also from a place of going like, this just kind of sucks. This is just hard. And we don't see eye to eye. And I actually do disagree with you. And I'm not going to say it in an insulting, attacking way, but I actually do think what you're saying is kind of dangerous and maybe crazy. I think there's space for that. And I think that's okay. And I think, you know, one of the things I've noticed being in spiritual and New Age circles for a long time is there can be this tendency towards spiritual bypass, where we want to go straight to the bliss and straight to the oneness and avoid all of the conflicts of what it means to be human and living in an imperfect world. And part of that spiritual bypass often centers around politics as well, where people I've heard for many years, people will say, well, I don't get into politics because it's too divisive, or I don't want to have these debates because it always devolves into one side is wrong and one side is right. But I think when we're talking about politics or we're talking about science, there actually are right and wrong answers. And the point is not to be completely non-judgmental about all of those things as if there's nothing right or wrong. I think the point is to be rigorous about why we think certain things are wrong or right, whether that's about scientific evidence or about moral values or about being open to the perspectives of marginalized people and understanding what their life situation is like and how it might be an incredibly egregious level of privilege to say that, well, maybe Donald Trump is taking us in the direction of light when people who are less privileged than myself, Black and brown people, immigrant people, transgender people are more likely to have suffered and died as a result of him being president. You know, making those clear distinctions, I think, can be held in an integrated way alongside all of the spiritual, compassionate, interpersonal, non-judging tools. And by the same token, having spirited debates about the nature of the world we live in and whether or not it's run by reptilian overlords who are overseeing a blood-drinking cabal of pedophile Democrats. You know, there are right and wrong answers to those sorts of questions. So sorry to be so long-winded.
That's okay. Karen, does that do it for you? Or did you want to respond? You'd have to unmute yourself to.
Well, most of your statements started with the word, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And I was bringing forth not thinking.
Mm. Would you like me to feel with you?
No, but what I felt was what I felt. Oh, that's funny because actually I'm very much an awareness person, and I've been working hard on being embodied. So the fact that I can start a sentence with saying "I feel" is progress for me. Believe me.
Beautiful.
But I don't feel we're all of us right now are being very present with each other.
Mm-hmm.
I think we're talking a lot and not really being here together.
How, if we were really being here together, how would it look? What would we be doing differently?
Yeah, I don't know, Rick, and so I'm just responding to, you know, I'm
yeah.
But I'm also talking to people who make
that. And,
yeah, I'm talking to people who make their living talking, so, and thinking and debating ideas back and forth. So I feel like I've walked into headwinds.
Why don't you sit with that as we continue on here, and maybe we'll want to.
I'm sorry, can I ask a question of Philip or Rick? You might know, what is the Buddhist tradition of debate called? I always forget, where there'll be like 4-6 hours of debating.
I'm just unmuting.
Yeah, I don't know what it's called, but I was about to say that I agree, not only agree with everything Julian said, but I wanted to, he said it's okay to debate. I want to say it's necessary to debate. It's important, it's part of the spiritual life to question, to investigate. Every spiritual tradition going back eons has valued debate. Buddhists debate, Hindus debate, they debate in monasteries, they debate in ashrams.
Hebrews.
Oh my God, Jews are beyond debate. There's an opinion for every Jew. So, but there are ways to debate, and there are ways to be together and disagree. But I want to bring out the reason this is an important subject to me. When I first heard that QAnon had penetrated spiritual communities, I was alarmed. I've been around this stuff for 50 plus years, and when I looked into it, I thought this is crazy. There's reasons for it. I was moved to write about it and publish something. There's always bizarre ideas, and there's always people who see things and claim they know things that most of us would think are irrational and crazy and bizarre and unprovable. That's always there. It's always going to be there. But there's a difference between somebody saying, I see a red reptile over your shoulder, and QAnon, which has real world consequences that are very, very dangerous. And it's one thing for it to be on the fringes of, you know, the white supremacy movement and militia groups and Trump cultists. But it's another when it finds its way into yoga studios and corrupts, you know, venerable teachings that are tremendously valuable in the world. And so I don't want to lecture, but my question for you guys who have looked into this is, how prevalent is it really? Is it the kind of thing that, you know, it affects a really small minority of people in what you've been calling the wellness and yoga communities, and yet because of the importance of it and the dramatic nature of it, gets a lot of attention? Or is it really more widespread than I'd like to believe it is? And I don't know if you've looked into that, but please speak to it.
I would say a troubling minority. And I say that because one thing that we've tracked and noticed is that some of these wellness influencers, when they started using QAnon hashtags, they would lose some people, and those people usually found our podcast actually because they would tell us about it. But they would gain tens of thousands of followers, or hundreds of thousands in some cases. Rashid Buttar is a good example of someone who went from like a minuscule social media following to hundreds of thousands once he started going on the anti-mask QAnon rhetoric. And one thing that happened, and QAnon is decentralized too, we should understand, well, it probably starts from a centralized place, but it's a decentralized phenomenon, which is something we're going to have to grapple with. I fully believe that we're watching the formation of the first digital religion, and how will cult leaders operate in this space right here to indoctrinate people. We have to grapple with that fact because it's happening. So because QAnon, and we've talked about this, Jillian has spoken about it in our podcast, you know, in the beginning, there was like kind of tethered to 5G and the problems of 5G, and it didn't really work. Partly because of the fact, because the advocates are using their phone on 5G to exploit their messages. But then when it got into the anti-vax movement, that's when the juggernaut happened, and really got into the yoga and wellness community, who had been skeptical. And that's a whole other story we can go into. But I think that I think it's going to get stronger. You know, there is a sense, and I am more liberal minded in terms of my politics and the way that I live. But I've noticed a troubling circumstance on social media, at least, and with people that I talk to, they kind of feel like now that Biden's won, things are going to course correct. And I think on an administrative level, like to do with things like getting the vaccines out to people and just day-to-day bureaucratic government, it's going to get better. But what has happened culturally and socially, I don't see that getting better. And I'm more concerned for next year and what manifests out of the white nationalist groups that have come out of this, and like that, again, that juggernaut that has happened, than I am about the bureaucracy at this moment.
Didn't you say that JP Sears recently made some video where he was toting a gun? And
Yeah. And that's a good example, like to speak to Philip's point before Jillian goes, when he joined Parler, he had, you know, very quickly 100,000 followers. And then 10 days later, I look again and he has 222,000 followers.
Who is he? Can somebody?
JP Sears. He's that funny guy with the long red hair who makes these satirical videos about, you know, being ultra spiritual. He's gone full tilt right wing.
Oh,
right.
My goodness.
You know,
Okay.
Not QAnon. So be clear on that, because I think that is important, because sometimes QAnon gets conflated with all of these other things, but he is specifically an anti-mask, anti-lockdown advocate that, because of that, found an audience on the right wing. Mickey Willis is another figure who has gone along that. and so but those lines are blurred, and they are difficult to discern sometimes.
Yeah, I wanted to add too that I think that there has, and there I am thinking again, I think that I observe that there has always been, with religion and spirituality, many beautiful, beneficial ways of coming together, and ways of growing and inquiring and exploring and practicing. But there've also always been destructive cults, and there've always been groups of people where it's just gone terribly wrong. And this has been true, going as far back as you like, and all the way up through what's happened in the last maybe 40, 50 years with the influence of Eastern spirituality on the West, and all of the different gurus that have ended up getting in trouble, and communities that have become very, very toxic. So I think a huge part of that, people who get sucked into cults tend to be drawn to this idea that me and the people I'm bonding with are all in touch with some secret hidden truth, and we're all part of an arc of history that is happening now that makes us important because we're the awake ones and we know what's really happening. And there's this event that's going to happen where the world is going to end, or the savior is going to come, or whatever it is, we're going to move into another dimension. That's a huge part of it. So, and I think most of us on this call probably have some of that predisposition. I think it's a predisposition to be drawn to that, to find that compelling. And I'm not insulting that. I'm not putting that down. I'm just saying, oh, that's an interesting aspect of what often makes people spiritual. And so with QAnon, Derek was saying they started with 5G, and then they eventually got to vaccines, and that hooked a lot of spiritual people in. I think part of what hooked them in as well was this idea that there's a great awakening that we're heading towards, that there's a secret cabal of reptilian, dark energies that are seeking to gain control, and we can be on the side of the light, and we can be on the side of people who are fighting that. And oh, isn't it interesting that Donald Trump seems to be so bad, and he says such horrible things, and he seems to be a misogynist, sex offender, bigoted person, but maybe he's just a trickster. And if you look at it from the right angle, he's actually the one who's going to bring about this great awakening and this birth of light. I think that appeals to and was, in a way, was kind of structured and angled to appeal to people like us. And it was very effective with a certain minority, but a much bigger group than I think I would have thought if you had asked me a couple of years ago. So I just wanted to add that to what we were talking about with Philip. But I want to loop back around, because I feel that what Karen had talked about is really, really important. And there may be other people on the call who have a similar kind of predicament. And I wanted to say this. We had someone as a guest on our show, named Hassan, Stephen Hassan, and he is a cult expert. He's someone who was in the Moonies. Some of you may be old enough to remember when the Moonies were around, and he eventually got out of the Moonies, and he became a cult expert. He's a psychologist, he's a therapist, he helps people whose families are in cults. And we asked him this question: how do you deal with people you really care about who've been indoctrinated into something that feels really dangerous and feels really, really toxic and destructive? Because I think there's a difference between if you're engaged in debate, or if you're talking to someone, on a more ideological or political level, versus if it's someone that you love and someone that maybe is in your family, or someone that's a close friend, someone that's a colleague. We said, how do you suggest handling this if you really care about what is, you're invested in this person's life and they're important to you? And he said, don't debate with them. It'll only push them deeper into it. Don't try to talk them out of it in any way that puts pressure on them. Stay empathically connected. Talk to them about the things you have in common. Be the person in their life that's actually connecting with them authentically and empathically, because over time, the bonds that they have with people around this cultish belief system are actually not going to be that. They're going to be very pressurized. They're going to be very conditional. They're going to be very caught up in whatever their particular mission is. And so being the person who stays in contact with them in a non-judging way, being the person who is not constantly trying to push your worldview on them actually is very important. And that if they are going to get out of it, it's going to take a long time. And
Julian, I'm sorry. There's one other thing he said
Yeah.
that I think is relevant here, which was remind them of the person they used to be. Right. Which,
yeah, whatever ways you can stay in touch with that and keep bringing that out of them, because they may not be experiencing that person when they're engaged in the ideology, in the cult dynamics. So I wanted to make sure I got to that, Karen, just in case that was helpful in any way to the reason why you're here today.
Good. I'm going to try to pace us so that everybody who wants to ask a question gets to do so in the next 20 minutes or so. So our next one is Tom Eckert. Tom is joining us from Germany. Go ahead,
Rick.
Tom. Hi.
Hey, and hello, everyone. So just first of all, I want to say that it's really, really lovely listening to you guys, and I completely bumped into you by accident. I mean, I just bumped into Derek's podcast today, reading the description. Unfortunately, I couldn't listen to it because I don't have Apple Podcasts. But then I saw your wonderful interview with Rick, and it really, really resonated with me. I don't really have a question as much as I would like to just bring something to the table, and maybe let's see how it kind of rolls from there. Which is, I basically work as a kind of spiritual teacher and numerologist. And this whole conspirituality thing that really just blew out of proportion during this COVID-19 time is, for me, is really, really mind-boggling. And as I was trying to, talk to some people and see why they think this way, and to see whether there's any way that I can help bring clarity, I realized that I cannot convince those who have already chosen to be convinced by conspiracy theories. And I do not really believe in trying to convince the convinced. I don't see it working. And I like to, for me, spirituality has to be really practical. So I won't waste too much of my energy trying to convince people that have already, that have too much invested in believing in conspiracy theories. And what I think is that my job as a spiritual guide or teacher is to make it as clear for people what spirituality is really about. And so, for example, I have this Facebook group where I try to, let's say, post as much quality spiritual information as I possibly can, and to make it really clear what it is about and what it's not. So to segregate the wheat from the chaff. And I think that this whole dealing with whether there are reptilians or whether there are Hollywood stars eating children for dinner or whatever, I'm not sure this is any relevance for spirituality. And the way I see it is that spirituality is about clarity. It's about being able to live a life of sanity, a life rooted in wisdom. And in that sense, I think science and spirituality really, really meet, because they're both seeking for truth. So what I want to bring to the table is perhaps how that I believe it's really important, and I want to know what you guys think about it, that people like us create a strong and solid, I don't know what's the word in English, forgive me, for you're all native speakers, like a kind of a strong and solid understanding among ourselves of what is really important to focus on in spirituality. Because eventually we're talking here about conspirituality and this whole confusion. And I think that many people just bring into the table of spirituality and spiritual seeking subjects that are not really relevant. So I think I'm repeating myself now. I think that's kind of what I wanted to say. So I hope I made myself clear.
Julian, go ahead. I'll follow.
Well, yeah, I like what you're saying, Tom, and thanks so much. I'm glad that you found us, and I'm glad that you're finding a lot to resonate with. I would just add to that I agree with you. For the most part, I mean, I think that for me, what has happened over time in terms of my own inquiry and journey is I've come to a place of defining, for me, spirituality as being about seeking to be as free of delusions as possible. And that has been a razor's edge, and it's included a lot of psychological work that I was previously avoiding. And it's included a lot of making peace with things about the world that in the past I didn't really want to face, and with making peace that certain things I really wanted to believe, if I looked into them more carefully, the evidence and the facts didn't support them. And that to me started to become more and more what I defined as being aware and being spiritual, was being as free as possible of wishful thinking or, pleasing falsehoods, and really trying to be grounded and be real. So that's my angle on that.
One thing I love about the podcast and why I love talking to Julie and Matthew on Slack every day and then in the podcast is we have differing voices and views on things. And I think our listeners appreciate that too, because we don't always agree on things and I agree with everything Julian said there, but I'm just saying bigger picture. And so I approach things from a level of data, and I love evolutionary biology and neuroscience. I love looking into the reasons why we are what we are. And part of it is sometimes it's difficult because we have different definitions of terms. Honestly, the term spirituality, it doesn't mean anything to me. I just aspire to keep my sanity and be a good person to others. And sometimes there's tension and sometimes things flow. But, it came up before when Jacqueline was talking, who's left now, but consciousness has a definition. It's your ability to attain to 4 to 5 things at one time, or it's whatever you're focused on at that moment, which is generally no more than 4 or 5 things at one time. Consciousness takes in different spiritual circles, takes on all sorts of meanings that aren't necessarily ascribed to it. And so it's really what we're all talking about, especially coming in different nations and from different cultures. It's really hard sometimes to come to a common definition of terms. And when I personally enjoy science, because there usually an agreed upon set of terms, and then you start talking from there. So with now more direct to your question, and excuse me for a moment, because it's not going to sound good, but humans are the most destructive animal in the history of this planet. In a course of 200 years, it took us from 350,000 years to about 200 years ago to get 1 billion people on the planet. 350,000 years to get 1 billion. In 200 years, we've gotten to 8 billion people. So all the stuff we're talking about today is we are going to have very serious resource management problems now with climate change. And all of it is because of what we've done to the planet. So I feel like Julian always talks about spiritual bypassing. I feel like a lot of what happens in the spiritual communities is a sort of bypassing of pretending that we're angels. And that can be defined in different ways. But my concern and focus is as simple as possible, is just being a good husband, being a good son, being a good friend to people, and to try my best to think deeply over these topics in relationship to both beliefs and data, and then put them forward, whether it's through journalism or through the podcast or through being a fitness instructor for 2 decades when we moved together with people. And so if I had a spiritual practice, it's that simple, is try not to let my emotions override everything all of the time. They will sometimes. I have a thing about people who text and drive, which infuriates me, for example. So I try to balance myself in those times. But a spiritual practice is just staying centered and just trying to help people. So what you said about the Facebook group and putting forward solid information, I think Julian will agree with me, that's what our podcast serves as. We're just being like, let's try to look at this information and then just try to do our best to assess it and put it forward to people, and then they can take it and run from there.
Good. Next would be Alan Levin.
Levin, yeah, thank you. And this is a very interesting discussion that we're having for me. And I want to thank you guys for bringing it to us. And I have one bit of a resource that I want to share with you that may speak to the discussion that Karen started. There's an organization that I recently became somewhat involved with and I'm exploring. It's called Braver Angels, braverangels.org. They bring together people who are self-identified right-wing red and left-wing liberal blue, and they have them come together practicing some of the more psychologically sophisticated and communication practices, facilitated discussions, trying to see each other's humanity with respect, and they seem to be fairly successful with it. And I think their tools, if they have videos on their website, braverangels.org. I didn't want to spend a lot of time with that, but I want to put that out there. I think can relate to many of the conflicting situations we get in with people who are in cults as well. This discussion is really bringing up a lot of really very complicated, in some ways, issues about what is spirituality, what is the nature of reality, how do we even define what is truth? And one thing I did want to say, though, it seems to me that perhaps your work with conspirituality has a kind of political emphasis. And one of my observations has been that everything has become politicized. And so spiritual communities and people within spiritual communities, I mean, I function as a meditation teacher, but also as a psychotherapist. And everyone who comes to me now is stressed, activated, troubled, depressed, anxious about the fact that about what's going on, but also the fact that they're unfriended or are being defriended by relatives and people that they know and people that they love and so forth. And people who have never been concerned about politics are now having very strong political opinions. And so naturally, people in yoga communities, spiritual communities, they are feeling the same thing, experiencing the same thing. So I'm wondering if that is really what's behind your sense of conspiracy, that essentially the political right-wing ideology has infiltrated into the thinking and feelings of people who you would have felt would be liberal and progressive and humanistic simply because they're in a spiritual community.
It goes both ways. That, you know, the term conspirituality has an origin, and it's in 2011 research paper, and it specifically is for right-wing ideologies and the wellness community. But it didn't just denote that the right wing were coming over to the liberals and taking that. It was also that the wellness community was moving in that direction as well because of similar ideas around lack of trust of government and lack of trust of medical institutions, which is something we also talk about because I just published a book on psychedelic therapy a few months ago, and half the book is talking about the problems with antidepressants and the way that we treat depression and anxiety and mental health in this country. And that you're right, because when you said things are complex and nuanced, everything is, because I both believe that vaccines work based on data and that this new one the two will probably work. But I'm deeply skeptical of pharmaceutical industry and lack of government oversight with that. But I also want to just address one other point with that, with the politics. You know, again, I live in what is considered a very liberal city in Los Angeles. And after 2016, I really expected that we'd see just a surge in voting. And in 2017, we elected our mayor, Eric Garcetti. 13% of eligible voters came out that next year. And I was just floored. I figured after the Trump victory that a city like this would band together and then show their democratic rights. I mean, if you think about it, in America, the one thing we can do as a democracy is vote. Like, there are many other layers, but that's like your entry ticket into a democracy. And I know so many people who don't vote. And so what you said right there is actually one of the things that inspired this podcast, the lack of political engagement that people in the wellness community have had because they've been able to live outside of it for so long. And as soon as it started to affect them in some capacity, they don't know where to look. They've been checked out of politics this whole time. So all of a sudden it's just like, well, where do I get my news? Oh, I get it from my Facebook feed. So let me look there because that's where I see all of my news. And then it became this giant feedback loop, which is the problem. In many other countries, people don't have the luxury of checking out of politics. And in America, I'm 45 years old. For the most of my life, I've just been politically active my entire life. Well, at least since college. But a lot of people I know haven't been. And so I think to address part of your question is that people have been able to check out for a long time. And then as soon as they weren't able to, when it was in their face, that they just didn't know what to do. And I think that played into this as well.
Yeah, and even more, where do I get my news? Well, I get it from my social media feeds. Oh, and the social media feeds have algorithms that are designed to keep feeding me stuff that stimulates that has a sort of sensationalist quality about it, and keeps me in a bubble of other people who are having similar sort of positive reactions or engaging reactions with that kind of material. And then we're in the midst of a pandemic where people have, both an increase in anxiety and fear about the future and uncertainty and disorientation, but also often too much time on their hands to then obsessively get into this and try and find connection with others while feeling isolated around, oh, there's this secret thing that's happening and me and my friends know about it, and we can all start to be on the side of the children who are being abducted or the Great Awakening that's about to happen. So I agree with Derek. I think some of it, to your point, Alan, some of it is everything becoming politicized in a way that I am similarly disenchanted with. I don't like it either. But there's another angle on that too, which is being unable to afford the luxury any longer of the privilege that perhaps had allowed a lot of us to say, oh, there's areas where politics just doesn't exist. It's a tricky topic.
Can I just respond quickly?
Yeah.
I'm not at all dismayed by the fact that people are getting involved politically.
Okay, yeah. No, I didn't think you were dismayed by them being involved.
5 years. So I actually welcome it, even though it's very uncomfortable for them. But they're integrating it into a lot of ignorance. But my question in a way for you guys, and I get a sense that you're coming from slightly different places, maybe from my read of how you're talking, is that if your motivation is this political right-wing thrust into the spiritual community, I get the sense that you're now conflating it a little bit with spirituality and truth-seeking itself and your views about whether or not that's okay and whether or not people can form truth about anything, and where do you draw the line between what a person perceives to be real from their intuition versus science and empirical study and so forth. So that's fine in a way, but yeah. It seems to me that there's slightly different categories.
Well, the very term conspirituality is acknowledging this synthesis between conspiracy theories and spirituality. Yeah. And so I think for myself, yes, I am bringing, and I think I can speak for Derek on just to a certain extent on this as well. I am bringing an attitude of healthy skepticism about reality in general, about how we apply scientific method, about what sorts of claims of knowledge make sense to me and are healthy both psychologically and rationally. and how I have my own position on how I think awareness practices can lead us in the direction of being more integrated and less delusional, for want of a more politically correct word. So yeah, I bring that to the table. It's part of the analysis that I have, which is to say that the New Age community has been susceptible to these far-right conspiracy theories because of the tendency towards patternicity, towards magical thinking, towards spiritual bypass. So those things are very much related for me. And yeah, I don't see them as necessarily being different, as rather as being that's the lens through which I've analyzed this QAnon infiltration of the wellness space.
And I should also point out that Julian grew up under apartheid in South Africa. So, he grew up in somewhere where it was ultra politicized. I mean, every facet of your life was politicized. So coming to America, I know, was a deep relief in some senses, but these are patterns he's watching now that he grew up in. And so he has that to bring to the table with these ideas.
Yeah.
Are you guys open to sharing how you yourself think one does derive what is true?
We're getting into the deepest philosophical questions. I think there are multiple modes of discovering truth, but for me, they need to be congruent with one another in order for one to have a coherent and integrated, and I would argue, sane worldview. So I feel like there are emotional truths, there are aesthetic truths, there are truths that are directly experienced that can't really be put into words. And there are scientific truths, there are philosophical, logical, rational truths. How you fit those things together in a way that is healthy and honest, to me, is what I'm fascinated with. And so there are many popular New Age beliefs and ideas that for me are left by the wayside in that process. And that was hard for me, some time ago. It's not hard for me anymore. I feel like I feel like the world is more wondrous, more filled with possibility and compassion and grace and beauty, and simultaneously more vulnerable and more achingly painful without some of what I identified for myself as delusions that I was invested in when I was younger. And that's just been the journey for me.
Yeah, I would agree. Basically, a slightly different pathway there. I think that studying religion academically made me an atheist. And it's because I would be on campus, and I was a religious columnist for 2 years at Rutgers at the school paper. And I would go from the Hillel house over to talk to an imam, and then I'll talk to a priest in the same day. And they all thought they had the truth, and that they were like, well, you're here, you found it, now we can talk. And I'd be like, well, I was just over at that guy's and he thought he had it. And so, there are 33,000 different denominations of Christianity, and this is all stemming from one book. So truth to me is just, it's always going to be relativistic. And as I addressed before, I think just being a good person is really the foundation of my practice. Sometimes I fail, sometimes I succeed, but just keeping my head on straight and trying to make it through these times.
We're going to go.
And everybody will tell you different ways to be a good person, so it will really confuse you.
There is that too. There is that too. Yeah, I would. The only thing I would add, and forgive me for stealing the mic again, but it's just that I personally feel that both the inner life and inner work and all of those internal values that I think are so much a part of awareness practice or spirituality, both that domain and the external domain of what can be understood and looked at, say, through a scientific lens, they are both enhanced by having healthy boundaries and healthy ways that they integrate with one another. And they are both diminished by overreach. So for example, if I were to overreach my experience when I was meditating into certain claims about the world that defy the laws of physics, for example, that to me would be unhealthy. And both are honored better when I hold them in a more grounded way. Like, I had this experience while I was meditating where I felt like I left my body, but I'm not going to claim I actually did leave my body, because that would be a different domain of truth.
We're going to go a few minutes overtime because I want to be sure to get to Peta Morton. She always has something good to say. And so I'm asking you to unmute. Peta, you're joining us from, aren't you, in Scotland or?
I'm Peter and I'm in France.
France, okay. Peter, sorry.
That's okay. I actually wanted to speak to Karen, but she's gone, bless her. But it was just coming back to what she said about how you hold that, you know, how do you approach people? And what I've found, I'm coming at this mainly because I've had a lot of students and friends that have been embroiled in, you know, I had a period where I was surrounded by, I think it's rife within, you know, the out-of-body exploration community and, you know, that kind of, you know, all the multi-dimensional exploration. I've seen a lot of people, you know, when they said, well, how many is it, how big a problem is it? In my world, it's a huge problem. I'm seeing, and people that are very rational and logical that were, and they're just completely red-pilled. But what I was going to come back to Karen and say was that my background is military intelligence and policing, and I've been doing a little bit of work for the Real Facebook Oversight Board, you know, behind the scenes, trying to stop this disinformation that's been propagated on social media. And I think there is a very active, I think they're being actively targeted, you know, that the spiritual community, I don't think it's random. I think it's been, and they're being bombarded with some subliminal material. And so had she been here, I'd have said to Karen, you know, that's what's helped me. On the one hand, I have not got a clue what we do about that. I don't know how do we manage that? I don't know. I really don't know, other than what we're trying to do, you know, to try and make Facebook accountable and, you know, and try and investigate what's going on with the government that, and there is a right-wing component to it. You know, I think, I don't think we cannot politicize it because it's coming from, you know, a key set of people that are pushing this stuff, and it's not just America. It's global. It's not just. It's certainly, you know, I'm sat here surrounded by Brexit stuff. It's an alt-right problem globally. You know, you just have to look at Modi in India at the moment. But I think I can have compassion for the fact that they've been bombarded with this stuff and they've been manipulated. So that's how I would sit with them. It's like, well, I don't agree with what they're saying. It's very hard to know at what point you don't argue, but at the same point, you know, where do you draw? You have to draw a line sometimes as well. It's tricky, but all I would say is I can still have compassion because I do think they've been manipulated. So that's how I can be with it and just say, well, yeah. So you're doing really interesting work. You're fascinating work.
Well, you actually, I mean, what a great way to conclude, though, because some people with some of what you just said about the behind the scenes would call that a conspiracy theory. But the difference is compared to that, as compared to, say, QAnon and the global pedophile ring of blood drinkers, is that what you've just expressed can be verified through looking at the computer networks and finding this out. And I think over time it will come to light. And that is something that's really hard to get across because there are real conspiracy theories. MK Ultra is one I write about right in the 1950s into the 60s, for example. And that is something that actually did happen, and now we can show it compared to what we cover with QAnon and some of the different things about like just kind of absurdities that are now parading as truth. And that's always going to be a difficult line to discern, especially with, you know, information so quickly accessible. So I'm very happy to meet someone who's working on the oversight board behind the scenes. So thank you for that.
Yeah, and just to flag it as well, again, I have no answers, but I just want to throw it out there. There's an awful lot more when if you're looking at keywords that keep popping up in the videos that these people are seeing, or in the you know, little pop-up adverts. A lot more encouragement towards violence. You know, they're all fighting now. They're fighting this work. You know, and we're all warriors of the light. And the rhetoric is becoming increasingly violent, I've noticed over the last sort of 6 weeks or so. So I'm just flagging it.
Yeah, no, thank you. We have one thing that we also offer on conspirituality.net is resource pages. One of them is our Red Pill page where we identify wellness influencers, and it's not like a call out page. It's just like, hey, this person is influential. Here are links to hashtags they're using and talking about these topics. And we also have one of QAnon keywords so that people can quickly identify if they're someone they admire is using the terminology. So that's very important. And it doesn't surprise me that there's been an uptick in violence and violent rhetoric since the election here. But it's frightening.
Very disturbing. I wanted to ask you, Peter, if you know Imran Ahmed.
Who?
Imran Ahmed, I believe is his name. He's the head of the Center for Countering Digital Hate. And he's in England. I'm not sure what city he's in, but we interviewed him, and that one actually might be really interesting to you if you wanted to check it out. But thanks so much for sharing what you did, and I'm interested in knowing more in whatever way I can about what you do.
Yeah. No, thank you very much. Really appreciate this. It's been a really interesting conversation.
All right. Well, let me conclude then. I want to thank our guests, Derek and Julian. We haven't had large numbers on this call, but that's good because it's been more manageable to have an actual discussion. And this will be going up on YouTube, and I'm sure many more people will be watching it later on. But I highly encourage anyone who's interested to go to conspirituality.net and listen to the podcast. And someone mentioned he can't listen to it because he's not, because he's not on Apple Podcasts or something. Aren't you on a number of different platforms, you guys?
Yeah, we're on Spotify, Stitcher. I mean, pretty much everything. So
good. So you should be able to find it on your whatever your podcast stream tool is, and it's a great podcast. I'm always amazed that you guys are able to make a living and yet put so much time into this thing, because I'm sure you're not getting rich off it. But
we're amazed too.
Pardon?
We're amazed too.
Yeah, but beautifully written essays and talks and stimulating conversation. And I just highly recommend it.
Really appreciate being here with you, Rick. Thank you for having us on, and thank you everyone who commented and shared and who was listening the whole time. It's a highly charged topic and a difficult thing to talk about and to listen to. So thank you.
Yeah, and it's evolving, so it'll be interesting to see how it develops over the coming months and years, where we're all heading with this.
Yeah.
All right, thanks guys, and thanks everybody. Our next webinar will be in about 6 weeks. We do them every 6 weeks, and alternately, one is a guest talk like this, and then the following one is just a conversation amongst ASI members, and then again the following week is a guest talk. The following one is a guest talk. So if anybody happens, well, probably everybody on this call is a member of the ASI, and you'll be getting notifications of these events as they roll out. So thanks for joining us.
All right, thanks Rick. Take care.
Bye everybody.
Thanks everybody. Have a great Christmas.
Yes.
Thank you all.